So we finished up our chapter on the introduction to managerial accounting. So at this point, you're familiar with the basic concepts of cost flow through the inventory accounts, the idea that manufacturing companies have all three of those inventory types: raw materials, work in process, and finished goods. Over the next couple chapters then, starting in chapter 16, we're going to be looking at different methods or different approaches to costing our product that we are manufacturing. So chapter 16 deals with one type of costing called job order costing, as you can see, and chapter 17 deals with process costing. We tend to talk about it because we tend to simplify things for class. We tend to talk about it as if companies use one or the other. But in reality, the same company might choose to use job order costing for one type of product and process costing for another type of product. So I want you to just keep in mind that we frequently talk about things in really black or white terms, and that's not necessarily true in the real accounting world. As always, we start the chapter with our learning objectives, and you can see those on the screen. So we're really going to be talking about, to start out here in our introduction, how a job order costing system works, why a company, in what circumstances would a company use a job order costing system, and we'll see briefly how this would be able to be used by a service company as well, although as always, our focus for this semester will be on manufacturing companies. So we just tangentially hit on, yeah, and other companies can do this too. But as you know, service companies, their accounting is a little bit more simplistic because they don't have a product at all. So their costs are limited to the direct labor and the overhead piece. They don't have direct materials. They're not selling or making a product. So why do we need to know about our product cost in the first place? Well, as you can imagine, this is managerial accounting. So we're talking about internal operations and making decisions about how best to run our company. So in order to know how much to charge our customers, well, we need to know how much it's costing us to produce the product in the first place. We need to have, and we'll talk about this, we have a whole chapter coming up on setting product cost standards. And why do we do that? Because we need to have something to know if we're doing a good job, right? So we need to have a comparison, a standard to use. And so in that upcoming chapter, we'll be talking about setting standards and then comparing our actual results to those standards. Those standards are like a goal that we set, like a budget that we set, and then we see, well, how did we do? We also need to know what our costs were so that we can report on those costs, and that's where we were focusing in the previous chapter on calculating cost of goods manufactured and cost of goods sold. So both of those two make up part of the calculation on our income statement. So in order to have accurate financial statements that reflect reality for our company, we need to know what those true costs are. So it's really about controlling our operations, making sure that we are being efficient and effective, that we are charging our customers not too much, but so that we lose sales because we're overcharging our customers. But at the same time, we need to be charging them enough to leave a reasonable profit margin to meet our targets or our projections. So knowing an accurate cost is important for us in a number of ways in terms of internal decision making. So as I already mentioned, we're really going to be looking in the next two chapters at two different, very different ways of looking at product costs. The first is job order and the second is process costing. So a job order, to use a job order cost system, we must know there has to be a clearly defined beginning and end to that manufacturing process. We started working on that product, we finished working on that product. Here are the costs that go to that product. So companies that use a job order costing system are generally making a product that's unique, one of a kind. There's a clearly defined start and end, as I already mentioned. They might be custom order. We're not making the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. So a company that is making the same thing over and over again, let's take, for example, a company that's making radios, a standard radio, and they spend all day long, every day making this standard radio. So while they may be able to, if they wanted to, while they might be able to trace the cost to a specific radio, do they really need to know, hey, the third radio that came out of the second shift today on line 2, that costs $14.37, but the fourth radio costs $14.39. Do they really need to know that level of detail? And I would argue that they probably don't. If they're making the same thing over and over, they can kind of average the prices together, or use process costing that rather than assigning cost to a specific product, it assigns cost to a time period. What were the costs that we incurred on Tuesday, or what were the costs that we incurred last week? The end result, regardless of whether you use a job order costing system or process costing system or some hybrid of the two, the end result is we end up with a cost for the product that includes direct materials, direct labor, and overhead, those 3 product component costs that we've been talking about. The question is, how do they get there? Is it easily, convenient, economic? Does it make sense? Is it the most efficient thing to trace cost to a specific radio, specific product? Or do we need to, or should we be looking at it more in the big picture and assigning costs based on the passage of time? So to use a job order costing system, it has to be a clearly defined beginning and end where it makes sense, where we really need to know that, hey, those are the costs for that product. So let me give you an example. If you are a contractor and you're building houses, even if you have just a few different floor plans or a few different models that you build, it's still important to know the costs that go to each individual house, because probably each house has some custom options. So maybe you get the third car garage, the third bay in the garage. Maybe you got the custom granite countertops instead of the cheaper version, or you got the extra half bath instead of the closet downstairs, or whatever it is. It's important that we know the costs that go to each house, because they're custom built, because they're a big project. It's very clear to know we started work on that house, we finished work on that house, here are all the costs. Back to the company making the radios. Yes, they maybe could assign cost to each individual radio, but it doesn't really make sense, because during a given shift, they're cranking out hundreds or thousands of them, and they're all identical. And it really doesn't matter which radio got dropped on the floor and had to be fixed before it could go out the door, so maybe had a little bit of extra cost to it. Some companies really don't even have an option of using a job order costing system because they follow a continuous process. In particular, companies that have liquid that's, everything is blending together. So you can see the example on the screen here of an oil refinery. Some of you may already be aware that in a previous life, my job was as the cost accountant for the refinery in Bradford, Pennsylvania, just over the border from us here in Olean. And so you'll hear me use that specific example because that is in my experience. So you'll hear me mention that how we did things as far as costing our products at the refinery. What we've learned so far is still going to apply. So I don't want you to think that, we talked about these concepts of direct materials and direct labor and assigning overhead, and we did that in chapter 15, and now you can set that aside. No, those same concepts are still going to apply, whether you use job order costing, process costing. Every product is still going to include all 3 of those components. every product is still going to go from being raw materials to work in process to finished goods. Every product that we make is going to include direct labor and overhead along with those direct materials. It's not a question of which types of costs are included, but how do those costs get assigned to the various products that we're making. For a job order costing system, as we said in chapter 15, the company is going to have those three inventory accounts: materials, work in process, and finished goods. Now, a company that's using a job order costing system may have more than one job in progress at any time or in process at any time. If you are a contractor, if you're a small contractor, you may only be working on one house at a time. But if you are a larger contractor, you may have dozens of houses, dozens of projects or jobs going on at the same time. You still have only one work in process inventory account, and that serves as the master or the control account. And then you have what's referred to as a subsidiary ledger, which is the detail for each one of those jobs that's in progress or in process at any given time. When we get to the process costing chapter next week, when we start that chapter, you will see that many companies, most companies use a process costing system, will actually have more than one work in process inventory account. But for companies that are using a job order costing system, they have just one work in process account, and then they have subsidiary ledgers, sub meaning under. So subsidiary is the detail of each one of the jobs that's in process. And if you added up all of those subsidiary ledgers, if you added up the totals of the amounts from each one of those jobs in process, that's what appears in the work in process account on the balance sheet or in our general ledger. That's why I refer to it as the master account or the control account, because it's the total, it's the sum, and the detail has to match up or add up to that sum. But the same flow of cost still applies. Materials into work in process, into finished goods, and then when it's sold, onto the income statement as part of cost of goods sold. So same process that we've been discussing since chapter 15. And then here's a good example of what I was just describing to you. So we have our materials, we have our work in process. So this company currently has two jobs in process, job 71 and 72. If you were to add the dollars from 71 and the dollars from 72, which will include direct materials, direct labor, and overhead, if you add all of that together for the two jobs, you would get this balance, the total, in the master or controlling account. This company has already finished jobs 69 and 70, but they have not yet been recorded as sold. It may be that those were custom order and they just haven't shipped yet. So if you think back to what you learned in financial accounting, when the title changes hands is when you can claim the revenues. We talked about how do you know if you've earned that revenue? Well, you have to have delivered the product or performed the service. And so it may be that these jobs already have a customer. It may be that they're custom designed or custom made for those customers, and they just haven't taken possession of it yet. It hasn't shipped. It might literally still be sitting on the warehouse or on the loading dock waiting for the truck to show up to transport it. Just because we finished it doesn't mean that it's the title has transferred to the new owners, to the customers. And so for these two jobs, they're still sitting in finished goods inventory. As soon as we meet our end of the bargain, then those costs will move off the balance sheet and onto the income statement as cost of goods sold. So these may not be custom jobs. I'm just suggesting they could be custom jobs. It may be that we made them on spec or on speculation, that somebody would buy it. If you make it, if you build it, they will come. If we make it, somebody will buy it. And so they might be sitting in our store waiting for the right person to come along and buy them from us. and that can happen too, certainly. Any questions so far? Let's take a look. Stop there for a moment. I'm going to go over to our exercises. And before our next class, when we keep going with chapter 16, I would like to ask you to complete exercise 1 on your own, because this, you have all the information you need to be able to complete this exercise. It really is reinforcing what we did in the previous chapter. So we have about 4 minutes of class left. I'm going to give you this last 4 minutes of class to work on this exercise on your own. I'm going to stop the video, and this will be the brief introduction for chapter 16. But when we come back next class, we'll pick up, our first exercise will be exercise 2. There is a show me how. You have to check my work. So finish up this exercise on your own, and at the start of our next class, I will ask if there are any questions about it. We can answer those at that time.